Radio Jones on iTalk FM.
And it's just 8 minutes past 6 o'clock here on Radio Jones, and we're going over now to the United States to meet Adam Kokesh, who's waiting for us now. Good afternoon, Adam.
Hey, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks very much for your time, and apologies for the mix-up on my part in the timing there. I take full responsibility for that. Adam, I'm going to ask you, please, for the sake of people in Europe who perhaps haven't heard your name before, to set your stall out for us. There are many people, of course, who will be aware of the small storm that you're kicking up there across the pond. But for those who don't, please do set your stall out for us.
Sure. Well, if you mean to give you a sense of how I got here, I was in the Marines as a reservist when I was in college, and I volunteered to go to Fallujah in 2004. And I volunteered to go back, and I was in the kind of sick state of mind where I was going to go back because I didn't get a Purple Heart the first time. And I got in trouble for having brought a pistol back. And when I got out, so I instead of deploying to Iraq a second time, I got in trouble and sat at Camp Pendleton for a year. And when I got out, I was just disgruntled enough, and this is a really important part of my story, and I think a lot of Americans who have had their quality of life in different ways radically reduced by government interference. But I was just disgruntled enough to really start questioning my participation in the war, and I was dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and a certain amount of cognitive dissonance. And I ended up joining up with Iraq Veterans Against the War and found myself surrounded by liberals as a libertarian in the anti-war movement. And as you know, most of us libertarians are pretty sure we're right about everything. We just have to prove it, So that was what really motivated me to start questioning my own philosophical grounding. And I wanted to know the airtight answers to all of the questions. I really wanted to be philosophically consistent. I didn't want to be a libertarian kind of by preference. I wanted to be someone who believed in liberty because of moral certainty. And it came down to a belief in the self-ownership principle and the non-aggression principle. And it's very simple, this idea that you as a human being own yourself, and all basis of morality or social organization should come from that respect of self-ownership, because anything less than that is slavery, some ownership being claimed by the collective or by some other. And so I ran for office after the anti-war movement largely became irrelevant here, when it was revealed to be, as it was dominated by lefties, more of an anti-Bush movement than a true anti-war movement, which was very disappointing. And I ran for Congress from my home state of New Mexico and lost, but I couldn't shut up when the race was over. So I got a radio show that became a television show sponsored by the Russians out of Washington, D.C., and I was canceled after just 4 months for political reasons that I can only speculate about. But I decided to go independent. I've been doing Adam versus the Man as an independent media operation since then, and it's just been amazing to see how the technology that's available to us now allows us to have this kind of new media enterprise where we have the ability to reach a significant audience without having to go through any of the gatekeepers. And it really does fundamentally change the conversation, and that's what I'm doing now.
Indeed. That gatekeeper, though, that you went through before from the channel that you were taken from, Russia Today, of course, is a channel that does bring us perhaps voices that those of us of a certain leaning are very pleased to hear, whether it be yours or another's.
Absolutely. Well, it's a certain form of counter-propaganda, and if you see governments as competing protection rackets, when one gets an unfair advantage due to propaganda, the others have an interest in challenging that. And the United States government has really been the expert in this. Russia is just barely catching up.
Yeah.
And while I don't like the idea of government-sponsored anything, if I was part of the government of Russia poking the American government in the eye, I was more than happy to do that. But the philosophy of liberty, when taken to its consistent applications, when you really apply these philosophical principles consistently, the only answer is to say that humanity is capable of self-governance, and we should be elevating humanity with that in mind and inspiring people to assert their self-ownership rather than saying, well, we need better government and you're still going to be part of a collective. And what I was saying on that show was challenging the premises of government itself, then it's a little too much for the Russian government to say, well, if the Russians hear about this, it's going to be bad for our deal too.
But you refer to yourself as an anarcho-capitalist, and that's essentially what you're referring to there, Adam, is anarchy. And realistically, self-governance, as you call it, another term for anarchy?
Well, in a sense, although this is kind of redefining anarchism, if you want to take it as a political philosophy, I much prefer voluntarism, the belief that all human interactions should be voluntary, that is, free of force, fraud, and coercion. And if what results from such a system is something that we still call government or massive collectives, as long as they're voluntary, I don't have a problem with it. My problem comes in where we reduce humanity's potential by accepting systems that say we can force our will on others in a coercive way. So anarchy in the sense that there are no rulers. We are capable of being sovereigns of our own lives. And I think this is really the destiny of humanity anyways. It's an inevitable course of evolutionary progress. But if you want to say, specifically, what does that represent philosophically? It's not no rules. It's no rulers. We want there to be lots of rules. I'm very much in favor of the law. I think the law is simply too important to be trusted to government. And the rules that we say should govern human behavior and interpersonal behavior and relationships should be determined in a peaceful manner, not based on this premise that we're going to have a central authority that has special rights, supposedly, that we don't have as individuals in terms of imposing its will on others.
Now, whilst you're explaining that to us, then explain to me where your pro-gun activism comes into this.
Well, I want to point out first, when you talk about the term gun control as it's being discussed, there is no such thing as gun control. People who say, I'm for gun control, are really saying, I'm for the government having all of the guns, and only the people in this small, centralized group of authoritarians, only they should be able to wield deadly force. And they should have a monopoly on that, and we should take that away from the citizens. And this really is the underpinning of what government is able to do. And I understand that there are places where the police don't carry firearms, but the relationship between government and the people based on the coercion and the force that is sanctioned by society is still the fundamental element that separates government from the people. And in America, we're supposed to have this tradition, and we do have a strong gun culture and a tradition of resisting authority, although it seems that it would be dead at this point, given the relative state of what the American founders revolted over compared to what the U.S. citizens are tolerating today.
Yeah.
But having that fundamental relationship of we are capable of applying deadly force, that is not something that the government has a monopoly on. But we also have to recognize that because human life is so very fragile, we are all living at the pleasure of each other as human beings. That the ability to take life is so easy and so convenient. I mean, am I a violent person because I'm fit and healthy and I have hands that could choke someone, or because I own a gun? None of those things make me a violent person, being able to assert my rights to apply force. And it's the denial of this that is behind the gun-grabbing efforts, behind the concept of government having this monopoly in the first place.
It's your right as an individual to be responsible to, in this case, carry a weapon and to not to use it aggressively, rather than an adherence to the Second Amendment.
Well, exactly. The Second Amendment is just words on paper as opposed to the moral philosophy that backs this up. But really, the burden of proof becomes what gives the collective or the government a right to tell an individual, this is an appropriate way to defend yourself, this is not. We are going to violate your property if you don't agree with us. And that's where the problem is, because if you say, how is gun control enforced? It's government enforcers coming with guns to point them at people who are owning guns peacefully and confiscating them, or essentially everything government does is backed up with the threat of force. If you don't pay your taxes, eventually men with guns come and take you and lock you in a cage. Mm-hmm. As I showed, and maybe some of your listeners are familiar with the Jefferson Dance Party from 2 years ago, where we, in civil disobedience, danced where they told us we couldn't at the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. Even when the government says you can't dance here, it means that if you do, we will forcefully take you away. And in my case, I was picked up by a police officer and body slammed on a marble surface. So being able to show that and demonstrate that is an important part of my activism. But these are really basic philosophical truths that are hard for people to face up to, because it means facing up to your cognitive dissonance about not being the alpha of your own life, of not asserting your self-ownership and saying, I am going to be a part of a herd, I'm going to be part of the collective, I'm going to go along and get along, and I'm not going to rock the boat, and I'm going to tolerate a certain amount of exploitation through government to get that, to have the nationalism, the soothing psychological benefits that go along with that. And I understand that humans evolved as pack animals. We're not solitary creatures by any stretch of the imagination. But as a society, we are all better off when we respect those rights of individuals and we take charge of our own lives and we say, we are going to not rely on a collective or others for our sense of self-worth or our being able to express our will as we move through life.
Now, Adam, you've called for, quite a ballsy shout out, I must say, for a new American revolution. What you have asked is for your supporters to march on Washington, D.C. on July the 4th, of course, American Independence Day.
Well, I should say we've had to have a modification in the plan since then. When we announced that, we saw that there were solidarity events happening in a lot of the state capitals. And I was actually arrested at a marijuana protest 2 weeks ago, and by federal agents set up and framed, and they tried to get away with charging me with assault on a federal officer. And it was only with a lot of support from the outside and some great clumsiness from the agents involved that I was released from prison after a week. And we decided having a centrally located event for this would no longer be appropriate. So we've shifted focus and are now calling for marches and are organizing events for all 50 state capitals.
Right, so all 50 state capitals. But explain then the illegally displayed firearms, because that's not going to work for all 50 state capitals, is it?
Right, and in some of those state capitals, now California, it's going to be very interesting because there the state government has recently passed some gun control laws on top of what was already a very restrictive situation there. And there may be some very specific acts of civil disobedience in California and in some other states. In some states, it's entirely legal, and people will be doing other things in civil disobedience. In some places, they'll just be marching. But the demand is clear. This is a new American abolitionism. We are calling for the abolition of the United States federal government, and to demand that the governors of the 50 states at least initiate the proceedings of seceding and reclaiming federally owned property. And are we realistically expecting that that's going to happen as a result of this protest? Of course not. But it's about time that we fundamentally change the conversation in America and start looking at this problem of being an empire in decline honestly and openly, because if we don't do this now, it's going to get a lot harder to do it later. And if anything, I've always thought that as libertarians, in a way, our message is, look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. And if you listen to us now and we start this transition and you take the medicine of what might be an unpleasant transition and, a little realignment, and yes, I'm sorry for everybody who works for the IRS, you might just be out of a job, but I'm okay with that there are going to be some rough spots, but if we do it now, or the sooner we do it, the easier it's going to be. The longer we put it off, it's like a toothache. Taking heroin for a toothache is the voting that happens every election cycle, where we pretend that voting is going to solve this problem, and we know it's not at this point. So the sooner we can face up to it, the easier it's going to be, the more peaceful it's going to be, the more orderly it's going to be, and the longer we wait, it could come to a dramatic collapse. But we need to face up to the fact that the course our federal government is on right now is not only immoral, but it's unsustainable.
I can't argue with that. Essentially, though, you're talking about moving forward peacefully with this demand, if you like. But the fact is that you have also said that should one whole year from July the 4th pass while the crimes of this government are allowed to continue, it may have passed the point at which non-violent revolution becomes impossible.
Well, in a way, we already have. I mean, as an American, you're 8 times more likely to be killed by a cop than by a terrorist.
Gosh, that's a shocking statistic.
Well, the government only tells you about the terrorism committed by its enemies that it can use as an excuse, whether real or fabricated, to increase its own power. War is the health of the state.
Yeah,
the government's war on its own people doesn't sell movie tickets.
What about the amount of anger that you're provoking in many parts of the American community? Of course, there have been some, I suppose, debatable voices who are damning you for suggesting that, as an Iraq veteran, that you should be voicing the kind of opinions that you're voicing, calling you unpatriotic and so on. And I suppose, families of servicemen who've been killed, injured, or hurt in any way, would have their own emotive reasons for feeling that way.
Sure. Well, patriotism is part of the problem. I mean, patriotism is a form of collectivism, and frankly, patriotism is for bitches. I mean, quite literally, people that are not capable of being the alpha of their own life, but derive an identity from being a part of the herd. And I've gotten death threats. I've got a page dedicated to me being executed for treason, but I'm not a patriot anymore. And I don't try to hide the fact in any way. I love humanity. But my love is not defined by arbitrary lines drawn on a map by politicians in circumstance of history. My love for humanity is defined by what I see in its potential. And I think there are a lot of people that have an emotional dependence on being a part of the collective, on being a part of the herd. And it's completely irrational, but that's why there's that knee-jerk emotional reaction, is that they in order to even consider the ideas that I'm proposing, they really have to open their minds to a certain degree, and if nothing else, get past that emotional dependence and those sort of roadblocks and own up to the cognitive dissonance. I mean, cognitive dissonance exists because of humanity's or the human psyche's capacity for denial and avoidance, and that's the state America is largely in right now. In fact, I would say humanity in general is in a state of denial in regards to the current state of statism itself. That is the current status of first world governments as institutions. And I think we're realizing that with technology, with everything else, with the information that's available to us on the internet, that governments are about to be rendered obsolete one way or another.
Certainly, though, that's exactly the way that government's authority has nurtured our civilizations to be at this point, to be at the point where a huge majority of the population, certainly of the country that you live in and the country that I live in, are perhaps narcotized, partly because of the difficulty of living a day-to-day existence when there are so many constraints put on you, but moreover also living in fear, because the government tells us, I suppose the obvious latest one is, the risk that we have from the terror threat from Muslim extremists, and these are exactly the kind of tools that governments use to keep us where we're supposed to be kept.
Right.
Now,
absolutely no, and I can tell you from my experience alone, we're making enemies faster than we can kill them. Terrorism is a product of government.
Absolutely. I don't think that can be denied, and I think that's a huge part of what we're seeing at the moment, and certainly, the fear instilled by let's say the Boston Marathon bombing that you saw in the States, or the killing of a soldier in London that we had in the UK recently.
Right.
Those particular instances are perfectly designed. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that they were carried out in any other way than those that the mainstream media tells us, because that's not what we're talking about now. But those the impact of those kind of events has an incredibly successful effect on the government continuing to be able to carry forth and justify the colonization, if you like, of parts of the world in the name of our freedom, of our safety.
Or in other words, never let a good crisis go to waste. But you mentioned earlier that a lot of people might have this attachment because government has gotten us to this point, and government has given us certain things, although I would like to take a more honest look at the historical record with this modern understanding of freedom and this modern understanding of the nature of government. And when you do that, you'll see that, if anything, government has hindered human progress. Government has held us back. I mean, look at just, like the question, who will build the roads? The real question at this point is, who is going to screw up the roads and keep us in a century-old technology when we're capable of so many better things? Even here in America, it's only because of government intervention that we don't have self-driving cars already. When the technology has been developed and demonstrated to be safe, it is literally just government regulation that holds us back from this. That holds us back from the commercial development of drone technology for the burrito bombers and the taco copters, and who knows, maybe drone taxis will render this entire infrastructure system obsolete. But you never know when you have a society that says, we can't settle these issues peacefully. We need a coercive central authority that is going to point guns at people and either keep them from competing or redistribute wealth or regulate businesses out of existence. When you do that, you are actually holding humanity back from its potential. But also, taking the longer view of human history, I have a very positive view, seeing this as all part of the evolutionary process from perhaps when a point existed that just whoever could pick up the biggest rock was in charge, to where we are today, which is actually, despite statism and modern governments in seeming death throes, like we saw in Cyprus and all the other financial shenanigans going on at the global scale now, that we are, despite that, living in the most non-violent times that humanity has ever experienced in terms of your immediate threats against you as an individual, at least statistically speaking. But when you see this in perspective, again, 8 times more likely to be killed by a cop than by a terrorist, it really puts in perspective, what is the greater threat to human life? What is the greater threat to human happiness? But when you understand government as what it is, as a coercive monopoly, it's like seeing the Matrix, and you can see all of the ways that humanity is held back by violence, by reliance on central coercive authorities, rather than demanding self-ownership and demanding that human relationships be free of force, fraud, and coercion.
But it's not just physical violence here that we're talking about, is it, in terms of coercion and so on? It's also the sort of psychological violence that is wreaked on the peoples of a nation ruled by the type of governments that we're talking about.
Well, this is what's so exciting about what's possible right now in 2013, because you really do point to something so important there, that one little threat of violence from one tiny minuscule part of the population affects everybody else, and they will go along and they will bow their heads and they will fall in line. And this is why people who are awake to this often use the term sheeple or make fun of people that are just going about their regular wage slave lives. And I don't like to use that kind of derogatory term, but you see the contrast when all we have to do is go, wait, you need us more than we need you. Why are we letting this one tiny thread of coercion cower us all into submission?
Uh-huh. I can't speak to you today, Adam, without, of course, mentioning Bradley Manning, whose trial started this morning in the United States, of course, arrested in Iraq and charged with the biggest leak of classified information in U.S. history. How does that, if we take this in terms of the conversation, the context of the conversation that we've been having, what about Bradley Manning now at this point in our evolution, if you like, what he's given us here as a pivot to perhaps confront what our governments are trying to do to us?
Bradley Manning is a very important figure in this historical era and represents an important question that has been put before the American people. When someone tells you that your government is lying to you, will you kill the messenger, or will you kill the government? And it really kind of, maybe it's not that extreme one way or the other, but it really is important. What do we do? And this trial is kind of America's last chance to go, okay, wait a second, Obama, I don't think so. You can't just silence whistleblowers. You can't just sweep this one under the rug. You can't just torture him, because frankly, what's been done to him, while maybe at the outer limits of what is legal in the United States, in no way should be mistaken as anything but torture. It is absolutely a disgrace how he has been treated and what he's been subject to as a detainee. And I can tell you, having just done 1 week in federal prison, my experience is insignificant to what he's done over 2 years now. And it's insane the kind of ridiculous treatment that he's received. But more importantly is how do the American people see this? And it's, oh, Bradley Manning, oh, well, Obama's doing that to keep us safe, bam, head back in the sand, or are people going to wake up?
Yeah. But no, and it's true, is it not, that Barack Obama has carried out more suppressing of those
whistleblowers.
Sorry, whistleblowers.
Yeah.
Thank you, is the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, no, it's to the point where people have referred to it in the alternative media, at least, as Obama's war on whistleblowers.
And what do you make of that, Adam?
You know, I guess it's just I was not surprised that Obama did not break the trend of being of every American president being that much worse than the previous one, and it's just because it's in the sort of bureaucratic momentum of government, you know, as I mentioned earlier. And how do you get to be president in this system? You attach the biggest strings to you that you can, and it's not to say that presidents are puppets, but they're power brokers, and the powers are on a much more reliable course, so to speak, than than any change that could happen through the political system. This is why I really don't think until someone comes along and says, you know, I'm running for office on the platform of dismantling the federal government entirely, or dismantling the state government entirely, or just something where it's like, this is it, wholesale, we're going to face up to this and we're going to do something about it. You know, I don't think any kind of political action is going to change things. And it was kind of a tragedy that it was the first, you know, at least half African American president that ended up, you know, being in charge right now when things are seemingly coming to a crescendo, being as bad and as violent as they are. But hopefully, you know, that should be a wake-up call to people too, because if we fall for this, oh, well, it's a black president, we're not going to protest now because of white liberal guilt or because we're black. And that's what it is in the United States. And I've gone out and I've done tons of interviews with people on the street. And a lot of the black voters who supported Obama are very candid about it, that they voted for him because he was black. Yeah. And that it was, and I even talked to some at inauguration this last year, this January, who came out and said it just straight up. It's a pretty good trick by the real powers that be behind the scenes to give us a black president, because then we'll be quiet.
Yeah, some would be much more cynical than you, and actually some would say that there is no it's no coincidence that he's black at all. The fact is that he was put there because he's black, so that this could be continued.
Right, and we'll probably next have a woman president if things keep getting worse. You know, because now that we can silence the superclass, the real power brokers behind the scenes can say, oh, look, now we can silence an entire half of the population for at least 8 more years. Yeah. I don't think the women of America are that dumb or gullible, but that it will have that effect.
And Adam, just before I let you go, your personal situation, you're speaking very candidly, very brazenly, heroically, actually, in my eyes, although I'm sure other people wouldn't agree. Are you concerned about your particular situation, your safety?
Yes, and that's one of the reasons we had to make sure that the Independence Day event was not centered on a single event or a single person, as it was shaping up to be, with going up to the line here in D.C. with a loaded weapon across my back. But yeah, there's kind of the part of your life that is before you're framed by the feds, and the part of your life that is after you get set up by the feds. And I'm taking appropriate personal security cautions, but if they want to come after me, they're going to get me. And there's nothing, when you're up against the biggest bully in town, like, you just have to take that risk and face up to it. But I think I've done a pretty good job of sort of dancing around the clumsy monster that is government, and showing people really that it's nothing to be afraid of ultimately, and in a sense is a reflection of the public paradigm. And as we change that by raising awareness, we all get safer. And I think the more visible we are, and this is sort of my policy, the more visible we are, the safer we are. And I kind of want everybody to have that.
I suppose as well, Adam, when you have actually seen combat in a situation such as you saw in Iraq, where you could have been killed during an illegal war, I suppose what you're doing now is justified to such a much greater extent than that.
Oh, absolutely, and I have far greater courage of my convictions now than I ever did serving in the military.
Wonderful. Adam Kokesh, I hope that we can follow you through certainly up to July the 4th and keep an eye on how it's going and how that does transpire. Adam versus the Man is the website. Adam, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Only the very young and the very beautiful can be so aloof, hanging out with the boys, all swagger and poise. I don't even care what other people are there. I just stare and stare and stare. I see your shadow in the swimming pool. I see your face in the shaving mirror, time and time and time again. I follow your footsteps so quietly up the back stairs, and I hope and I pray you ain't never gonna find me there. Smooth skin and tenderness, long ago on a dark night. Wish I could see you once again, just to remember that it was true. I wanna be still beside you,